I remember the first time I met Buddy. It wasn't in some dramatic, life-altering moment, but rather a quiet realization that, like me, he had been broken in ways that words could never fully describe. My name is Ethan Parker, a 37-year-old war veteran, and I had come back from the battlefield scarred, but in ways that were invisible to most people. The scars weren't just on my body, they were embedded deep in my mind, tucked away behind walls I had built around myself. Even after therapy, even after returning to a normal life, I felt empty, unfinished. There were days when I felt like a stranger to myself. And then there was my sister, Olivia. She's older than me, a few years. But in that time, she had become someone I turned to when the weight of everything became too much to bear. She knew something was wrong long before I admitted it. She suggested something simple. Maybe too simple: you should get a dog. Something to help with the healing. You know. Something to fill the silence. I laughed it off at first. A dog? I could barely take care of myself, let alone a pet. But Olivia insisted, telling me I needed to find something to live for again. One day, I found myself standing outside an animal shelter in the heart of the city, feeling ridiculous and out of place. I had no idea what I was doing there. But inside, something was pulling me forward. I walked in, surrounded by barking and the occasional whimper of dogs eager for a home, a family, or even just some attention. I walked past several kennels, my eyes scanning the dogs. Each one had a story, a history, just like me. Then I saw him. Buddy. He was an older German shepherd. And though he seemed calm, I noticed the wariness in his eyes. There was something about him. Something that drew me in, even though I had no idea what I was looking for. The shelter worker mentioned that Buddy had been a military dog, retired after an injury in service. And now, like so many of us, he was struggling to adjust to civilian life. At first, Buddy didn't recognize me. I should have expected that. But a part of me, a foolish part, thought maybe he would remember the days when we had fought side by side, when I was his handler and he was my partner. But when I approached his kennel, Buddy didn't run to me or even wag his tail. Instead, he looked at me with a cold detachment, almost like I was just another stranger. And in that moment, I realized the truth: we were both broken. The shelter worker said he had been through a lot, and his trust had been shattered. He had become distant, distrustful, and anxious, much like I had after returning from the battlefield. There was a part of me that wanted to turn away, to walk out of the shelter and leave the pain behind. But something in me refused to walk away. I couldn't leave him there. Not when I knew exactly what it was like to feel like there was no way out. After some time, I decided to take Buddy home. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but in that moment, I knew it was what I needed, what we needed. And when I brought him into my house, I realized that, just like me, Buddy was a ghost of the dog he used to be. He was cautious, skittish even, as if waiting for something bad to happen. And in his eyes, I saw the same walls I had built around myself, walls that had been constructed out of fear and trauma. Buddy spent the first few days at my house avoiding me. He would wander around, his eyes darting back and forth, looking for some sign of danger. His body remained tense, and he avoided any form of affection. Even when I sat quietly near him, hoping to bridge the gap between us, I tried to be patient. I didn't push him, though there were moments when I couldn't help but feel discouraged. I could see the dog he used to be, the dog who had been my partner, but it was buried so deep under layers of fear and mistrust that it seemed impossible to reach. I knew I couldn't rush him. Healing didn't work that way. It was a slow, painful process, and the more I pushed, the more he retreated. The first breakthrough came when I decided to try something that might trigger some kind of memory for him. I dug through the box of old military gear I had kept from my time in service. The vest, the whistle, The old rubber ball, each item was a reminder of the days when Buddy and I were inseparable. When we worked together as a team. I held up the vest and let Buddy see it. At first, there was no reaction. No recognition. But then, as I put the vest on, something changed. For the first time since bringing him home, Buddy's eyes softened just a little. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He took a step closer. That small moment was all I needed. It gave me hope. It reminded me that things could change, that we weren't beyond saving. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that we could heal together. Buddy was more than just a dog. He was a reflection of everything I had gone through, everything I was still going through. And maybe, just maybe, together, we could find a way to move forward. We both had scars. We both had stories to tell. But we also had time. Time to rebuild. Time to heal. And in that quiet space, I began to hope again. It's strange how, sometimes, the hardest thing isn't the pain itself but the weight of the silence. For the first few days after Buddy came home, the silence between us was deafening. He'd avoid looking at me, retreating to a corner of the living room, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to believe that he was safe. I couldn't blame him. After all, what had either of us been through? The battlefield had a way of breaking things, leaving behind only shadows of the creatures we once were. But that was the thing I had to remind myself of. We weren't the same anymore, but that didn't mean we couldn't still be something. In those early days, I would sit by the window, watching Buddy as he paced back and forth in the yard, his movements cautious, as if every leaf, every sound, was a potential threat. He would sniff the air, his ears flicking at every passing noise, and I'd wonder if he could still remember what it felt like to run free, to play without fear, as we once had. I wanted so much to break through to him, to pull him from the depths of whatever dark memory held him captive. But every time I tried to approach, every time I reached out, he backed away. He'd look at me with the same cautious eyes, but there was something distant, something almost unreachable in them. There was a moment, one that stands out in my memory, when I almost lost hope. I was sitting on the porch one afternoon, watching Buddy from a distance, trying not to let him feel my eyes on him. It had been days since I had seen even the slightest hint of recognition, let alone affection. I was starting to wonder if it was all in vain. But then, just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the yard, something changed. Buddy slowly, hesitantly, walked toward me. He stopped just a few feet away, his head lowered. But his body language had softened. His tail, once rigid and unyielding, now gave a slight wag. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me the courage to try again. Slowly, I reached my hand out, palm open, not wanting to scare him, not wanting to rush anything. Buddy sniffed the air, took a tentative step closer, then paused again. In that moment, I understood. Healing couldn't be rushed. It was a slow process, and it needed to happen at his pace, not mine. I sat there, holding my breath, letting the silence linger between us. Then, with a small sigh, Buddy took another step forward. He pressed his nose into my hand, the warmth of his touch sending a rush of emotion through me. It was the first time in days that I felt connected to him. The first time I felt like we were beginning to rebuild something we had both lost. It wasn't perfect, and I didn't expect it to be. But in that simple touch, I knew we were on the right path. The days that followed were a series of small victories. I started spending more time in the yard with Buddy, sitting quietly and letting him come to me when he felt ready. There were moments when he would linger by my side, just watching me, as if he was trying to decide if he could trust me again. Other times, he would run off, darting into the corner of the yard or disappearing into the shadows of the trees. But I never chased him. I simply waited, patient, letting him come to me on his own terms. One evening, I tried something different. I grabbed the old rubber ball, the one I used to throw to Buddy when we were partners, back when we were soldiers together. I tossed it lightly across the yard, not expecting anything. For a long moment, Buddy just stood there, watching the ball bounce across the grass. Then, as if a memory had sparked, he moved. His body tensed, his eyes fixed on the ball, and before I knew it, he was running toward it. I could hardly believe it. My heart raced as I watched Buddy pick up the ball in his mouth and trot back toward me, tail wagging ever so slightly. I didn't know if he remembered why he used to love that ball or if it was just the movement, the simple action that triggered something in him. But in that moment, it felt like a small but powerful breakthrough. "Good boy, Buddy," I said softly, almost in disbelief. He dropped the ball at my feet, looking up at me with those eyes that now seemed a little less distant, a little more trusting. It was a sign that, despite everything, we weren't too far gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Buddy's progress, about how far we had come, how much we still had to go. There were no guarantees, no promises that things would be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. Buddy had taken a step toward me, and that was enough. It was a small victory, but it meant the world to me. As I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the night, I knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning. And whatever came next, I was ready, because Buddy was worth it. The days slowly bled into one another, a quiet rhythm of mornings and evenings punctuated by the soft sounds of Buddy's tentative steps, the rustling of leaves in the yard, and my own heartbeat still uncertain, still learning how to find its place again. We were both navigating this new chapter, unsure of what it meant, but determined to find our way. Buddy was still distant, but there were signs of change, subtle flickers of the dog I once knew. I kept my expectations low, allowing him the time he needed, never rushing him. Patience, I learned, was the most important lesson in our journey together. I would sit by the window, watching him from a distance, allowing him to set the pace of our interactions. Some days he would approach, sniffing the air as if trying to recall something buried deep inside him. Other days, he would keep his distance, wandering aimlessly, like a ghost trapped in the past. But those small moments, those brief glances, the tentative steps toward me kept me going. I found myself speaking to him more often, telling him stories of our time together. I didn't expect him to understand the words, but I hoped the tone, the familiarity of my voice, might remind him of something, of who we used to be. One afternoon, after weeks of silence, Buddy surprised me. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, watching me with a quiet intensity. For a long moment, neither of us moved. He was still cautious, his body tense, but his eyes were different now. There was a flicker of recognition in them. My heart swelled in my chest as I realized he was no longer completely lost to me. He was beginning to see me again. I knelt down slowly, making sure not to make any sudden moves. "Hey, Buddy," I whispered, my voice soft. "You okay?" He didn't respond at first, but after a long pause, he took a step closer. My breath caught in my throat as he sniffed the air around me, his nose brushing against my hand. It was a small thing, but it was enough to fill me with a hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. I didn't push him. I simply stayed there, grounded, letting him take the lead. He circled me once, then sat down, his body still a little tense but no longer as withdrawn as before. I remained on the floor, cross-legged, watching him carefully, waiting. I could see the internal struggle within him. He wanted to trust, but something held him back. It was the same for me. I wanted to rush in, to close the gap, to make everything feel normal again. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't something I could force. That evening, as the light faded and the house grew quiet, I decided to try something different. I grabbed the rubber ball, the one that once symbolized the bond between us, and tossed it gently across the yard. I didn't expect anything. I wasn't even sure if he would remember what it was. But then, after a few moments of stillness, I saw it. Buddy perked up, his ears twitching, his body stiffening as he watched the ball bounce across the grass. It took him a few seconds to decide, but then he moved. Slowly at first, then faster. With the same determination I remembered. He picked up the ball, trotting back toward me, tail slightly raised in a gesture of cautious excitement. I couldn't stop the smile that spread across my face. "Good boy, Buddy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. He dropped the ball at my feet, looking up at me, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Trust. That moment, small, seemingly insignificant, was a victory. It was proof that we were making progress, even if it didn't feel like it. And as Buddy lay down beside me that night, his body a little less rigid, a little more at ease, I realized that the road to healing wasn't a straight path. It was filled with bumps, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But it was a road we were walking together. And that was enough. For the first time in a while, I felt a glimmer of hope. There were still days when Buddy would retreat into himself, when the weight of his past would become too much. But there were also days like today, days when I could feel the connection between us growing stronger, one small moment at a time. And as we faced the future, side by side, I knew that no matter what happened, we would keep moving forward, together. The days seemed to pass with the weight of time stretching between us, both Buddy and I working through the silent challenges that marked our journey. Every now and then, a breakthrough would happen, a fleeting moment of recognition, a subtle shift in Buddy's behavior. But with those breakthroughs, there came the tension of not knowing if we were truly healing, or merely moving through the motions. Still, I refused to give up. I had come to understand that this healing process was far from linear. But that didn't make it any less significant. With every small victory, there was a chance for something deeper to unfold. And so, I persisted. I began to set routines, gentle, non-threatening activities that I hoped would spark something familiar in Buddy. Something to remind him of who he once was, and who we could be together again. One morning, I decided to bring out the rubber ball again. It had become a small symbol for us of a time when Buddy was full of life, energetic and playful, always ready for the next throw. I tossed it across the yard with a deliberate, slow motion, watching Buddy closely. For a moment, he only stared at it, his gaze flickering between the ball and me, his body tensed, unsure. I waited. "It's okay, Buddy," I murmured, trying to offer some sense of reassurance. "We'll take it slow." Then, after what felt like an eternity, Buddy took a step forward. Tentative, slow, his eyes still fixed on me as though seeking my approval, or perhaps asking for permission to let go of whatever burden still weighed on him. When he finally nudged the ball with his nose, I could feel my chest tighten with a mixture of relief and hope. It was small, but it was something. A spark, however faint, had reignited. Each day after that, I made a point to introduce small acts of kindness, nothing too overwhelming. Just simple, non-intrusive gestures. Sometimes it was offering him food from my hand. At other times, I'd sit next to him, just for the comfort of quiet companionship. I began to see his responses change. Albeit slowly, he would stay closer to me, follow me around the house, and even sit beside me on the couch for short periods. These weren't grand gestures, but to me, they were monumental. One evening, after another quiet day spent together, I sat on the porch, watching Buddy as he lay at my feet, eyes half closed. I couldn't help but talk to him. even though I knew he didn't fully understand. I remember. Buddy, I said softly, when you would be by my side no matter what. We were a team, weren't we? He lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest of moments. There was no immediate response, but I felt a stirring deep within me, a glimmer of hope that our bond wasn't entirely gone. The next day, I decided to try something different, something that might push him just a little further without overwhelming him. I went to the garage and retrieved the old military vest. I held it up in front of him, letting him sniff it slowly. The scent was faint, but I hoped that it would bring some memories to the surface. For a few moments, he didn't react, and my heart sank slightly. But then, I saw it. A shift. A slight wag of his tail. His nostrils flared, and his ears perked up as if something was stirring deep within. I slowly put the vest on him, adjusting it with care, mindful of the delicate nature of the moment. It wasn't just about the vest itself, it was about the memory it carried of our time together. Of missions. Of trust. As I secured the straps, Buddy stood still, his body tense. But there was something different in his stance, a flicker of recognition. A sense that he wasn't completely lost. I took a step back, giving him space. We were no longer just two souls in the same house. We were two survivors, each carrying our own pain, but both trying to make it through the other side. And as I watched Buddy, his body still slightly rigid but no longer completely guarded, I knew that we were beginning to rebuild. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when he would retreat into himself. But there were also days like today, days when I could see a glimpse of the dog I had once known. And it filled me with a quiet sense of peace. I didn't push him further that day. I simply sat with him, the vest still on his back, my hand resting gently on his head. For a moment, everything felt still, almost sacred, as if we were both honoring the space between us and the journey ahead. And though the path to full recovery was still long, I was starting to feel a sense of trust building again. Brick by brick. Moment by moment. We weren't there yet, but we were getting closer. And that, in itself, was enough for me. The days continued to blur into one another, each one marked by quiet progress and tentative hope. Every small step, every change in Buddy's behavior felt monumental to me. It wasn't just about the physical milestones, like him fetching the ball or eating from my hand. It was something deeper. It was the emotional shifts that I saw flicker in his eyes. Those moments when I realized that he was slowly starting to trust me again. One evening, as I sat in the living room, I noticed Buddy staring at the old photo of us that had been sitting on the shelf for weeks. It was a picture from our last mission, taken just before everything changed. We were both exhausted, covered in dirt and sweat. But in our eyes, there was something else: pride, loyalty, and an unspoken bond that had been forged over years of shared experiences. I picked it up gently and walked over to Buddy, who was lying on his bed. "Look, Buddy," I said softly, holding the photo up to his gaze. "We made one heck of a team, didn't we?" For a long moment, Buddy didn't react. His eyes stayed fixed on the photo, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. Then, just when I was starting to doubt if he even remembered, something in him shifted. He leaned forward slightly, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air, almost as though he were searching for the familiar scent of the past. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my heart swell. There was something there. Some fragment of recognition that I hadn't realized I was waiting for. I sat down next to him, gently placing the photo beside him on the floor. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" I whispered, reaching down to pet him slowly, careful not to rush him. Buddy allowed the touch, his eyes still focused on the picture. For the first time in weeks, there was no flinch, no sudden withdrawal. It was a quiet moment of acceptance, one that spoke volumes about how far we had come together. The next day, I decided to try something else. something that I had been hesitant to do for fear of pushing him too hard. I grabbed the old military whistle from the drawer where I had kept it tucked away. The sound of the whistle had always been a signal to Buddy, a command that he had followed without hesitation during our service. But now, it felt different. This was a sound that belonged to a past neither of us could fully relive. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, could it spark something in him? Could it bring him back to a time when we were more than just two beings trying to survive? I stood on the porch, the whistle in my hands, Buddy lying at my feet. I took a deep breath and blew it, 2 sharp, quick bursts. The sound echoed through the yard. And for a moment, I held my breath, unsure of what would happen. Buddy's body stiffened. His ears perked up, his eyes wide with attention. And then, to my surprise, he didn't bolt away. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, his gaze meeting mine. There was hesitation in his eyes, but also something else, a flicker of recognition. A glimmer of the old Buddy, the one who had trusted me without question. I waited, still, letting him decide. And after a long moment, Buddy stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. He took a few tentative steps toward me, his eyes still locked on mine. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it, this was the moment I had been waiting for. Slowly, I crouched down and extended my hand, allowing him to approach at his own pace. When he finally reached me, he sniffed my hand carefully before gently nudging it with his nose, as if asking for permission. The touch was subtle, but it was everything. I didn't try to pet him. I simply stayed still, letting him set the pace. The bond we had once shared, the trust we had built over countless days in the field, was starting to return, slowly, but undeniably. It was a small step, but it was a giant leap forward in our journey together. Later that night, as we sat together on the couch, I realized just how much had changed. Buddy was no longer the distant, broken creature who had first arrived at my home. He was beginning to open up again, just as I was. There were still moments of hesitation, of fear, but they were becoming less frequent. And with each small act of connection, I knew we were getting closer to the healing we both needed. The photo, the whistle, the gentle touch, all of these small gestures were more than just symbolic. They were the foundation of something bigger, the restoration of our trust, the rekindling of the bond that had been fractured by time and trauma. And as I watched Buddy settle beside me, his head resting gently on my leg, I knew that despite everything, we were still a team. And together, we would continue to heal, one small step at a time. It wasn't just the small moments that had changed. There was a shift in the air itself. A new feeling that hung between Buddy and me, one that was rooted in something more profound than any training exercise or comforting gesture. It was as if we had both come to terms with the reality that healing would take time. But we had finally started the journey. And, for the first time in a long while, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years, hope. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the window, I decided it was time for us to venture beyond the house. It had been weeks since Buddy had arrived, and though our bond had grown, the world beyond these walls still felt like an alien place to him. But I knew that the park, the one we used to visit during our downtime on base, could help. It had been a place where Buddy and I had shared our happiest moments together, days full of sunshine and laughter. Just a man and his dog, without a care in the world. I wasn't sure if Buddy would recognize it, but I had to try. I woke up early that morning, letting the warmth of the sun draw me out of bed. Buddy was already awake, lying on his bed near the window, his gaze fixed on the yard outside. I walked over to him slowly, my footsteps soft on the floor, and knelt down. "Hey, Buddy," I said quietly, "how about we go for a ride?" He turned his head toward me, his ears perked up. There was a moment of hesitation, but then, as if sensing my intent, he stood up and wagged his tail, slowly at first, then a little faster. as though he was giving himself permission to be excited again. I smiled, the tightness in my chest easing just a little. This wasn't going to be easy for either of us. But I could see that Buddy was ready to try. I grabbed the leash and clipped it onto his collar. We headed out the door. And as I opened the truck door, Buddy hopped in without hesitation, settling into the back seat with an ease I hadn't seen in him before. He sat up, his head poking out of the window as the wind rushed past us. I watched him through the rearview mirror, my heart swelling with pride. This was the Buddy I remembered. The one who had been so eager to get in the car, tail wagging, ready for whatever adventure we would have together. When we arrived at the park, I let Buddy out of the truck, keeping the leash on just in case. He paused for a moment at the edge of the grass, sniffing the air, taking in the familiar scents. I could see the tension in his body, the way he was holding himself back, as if unsure whether to let go of his anxiety or to stay trapped in his memories. But then, something shifted. He stepped onto the grass and paused, looking up at me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the rubber ball, the one he used to love fetching so much. I tossed it into the air, watching it land a little ways away. "Go get it, Buddy," I said, my voice gentle but firm, the way I used to speak to him during our training. For a moment, Buddy just stared at the ball, his eyes focused, as if weighing the decision in his mind. And then, with a burst of energy, he ran toward it, his paws thumping on the ground, his body moving with a fluidity I hadn't seen in him since before the trauma. He picked up the ball in his mouth, tail wagging slightly, and trotted back to me. My heart pounded in my chest as I knelt down to accept the ball from him. "Good boy," I said softly, the words catching in my throat. It was a small victory, but to me, it meant everything. Buddy had come back to life in that moment. And so had I. We spent hours in the park, running, playing, and simply being together. I watched Buddy as he reveled in the freedom of the open space. And I couldn't help but think about how far we had come. There had been times when I wasn't sure if this moment would ever come. But here we were, a little scarred, a little broken, but still together, still moving forward. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, I sat on a bench, and Buddy lay down next to me, his head resting on my leg. We didn't need to speak. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with an understanding that we were no longer just two souls struggling to survive. We were a team again, rebuilding the bond that had been shattered. I looked out at the horizon, the soft sound of Buddy's breathing the only thing breaking the stillness. "I told you I wouldn't give up," I whispered, stroking his fur gently. The words were a promise that no matter what came next, we would face it together, side by side. And in that moment, I knew we had both found something we had been searching for all along, a new beginning. As I sat there in the park with Buddy resting by my side, the cool breeze rustling through the trees, I realized something profound. We were no longer the same people or the same dog that we had been when we first met. The scars of war, the pain of separation, and the weight of trauma had reshaped us. But in our journey together, we had learned something invaluable, that healing doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen alone. It happens when you face the pain together, when you trust in the process, and when you believe that love and patience can rebuild even the most broken of bonds. For me, it was a lesson in perseverance. When Buddy first came home, I was consumed by doubt. Could I help him? Could he ever trust me again? But in every step we took, in every small victory, I found the strength to keep going. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the silence between us felt deafening, when his fear seemed insurmountable. But I had to remind myself that the road to healing is slow and steady, and that the love between us, the history we shared, was worth every bit of effort. That day in the park, watching Buddy chase after the ball as if nothing had changed, I realized that healing isn't about erasing the pain or the past. It's about embracing it, learning from it, and growing beyond it. I had learned that true strength comes not from avoiding the darkness, but from walking through it, knowing you have the capacity to find your way back to the light. As for Buddy, his lesson was one of trust. He had been hurt, betrayed by the very people he trusted most. He had lost faith in the world, and in himself. But with every day, every small gesture, every step forward, he began to let his guard down. He realized that not all humans would hurt him, not all experiences would bring pain, and that not every moment had to be met with fear. In the park, when Buddy finally fetched that ball and brought it back to me, there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time: hope. For the first time in weeks, his gaze met mine without hesitation. His trust wasn't complete yet, but it was there. And that's when I understood that healing isn't just about the person doing the helping, it's about the one being helped learning to believe in themselves again. Buddy had learned that not only could he trust me, but he could trust the world again. One small step at a time. In the quiet moments of our lives together, whether it was lying on the couch or walking through the yard, I saw Buddy grow not just into the dog he used to be, but into a version of himself that was stronger, braver, and more whole. And I began to see that same strength in myself. Our journey wasn't just about fixing what had been broken, it was about rebuilding, bit by bit, in a way that made us both more resilient, more compassionate, and more alive. The lesson was clear: no matter how deep the wounds, no matter how long the road to healing may seem, we are never truly alone in our struggles. The bond between us, forged in the heat of battle, tempered by time and hardship, was unbreakable. Together, we would face whatever challenges the future might bring. And with each passing day, I knew we were not just healing, we were becoming the best versions of ourselves. So, we moved forward, side by side, not as two broken souls, but as two partners who had learned that love, patience, and trust could heal even the deepest wounds. The future was uncertain, but with Buddy by my side, I knew we were ready to face it, together. And that was all that mattered.